That animal watching you may not be just an animal. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal is the reason many prayers feel blocked. I didn't always know what I was looking at. At first it felt harmless, almost easy to ignore. A pattern you dismiss. A coincidence you excuse. A presence you explain away, because acknowledging it would require you to admit something far more uncomfortable. That observation does not always come from human eyes. I was trained to send them. That is my testimony, and I am no longer hiding behind silence. There is a side of warfare no one announces, no uniforms, no alarms. It happens quietly, in rooms where paperwork replaces weapons and intention replaces force. I learned early that the most effective battles are never loud. They are personal. They are targeted. They are patient. And they are fought where belief lives. I watched people grow tired for no clear reason. I watched resolve thin out, discipline fracture, memory blur at critical moments. I watched devotion weaken without rebellion, faith soften without a fight. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and accuse. Just erosion, slow, precise, designed. The truth is this: surveillance does not always look like machines. Sometimes it breathes, sometimes it blinks, sometimes it waits where no one would suspect, positioned close enough to feel familiar, distant enough to remain unquestioned. I am confessing now because I recognized the signs too late in myself. There were protocols. Always protocols. You don't call it harm, you call it observation, you don't call it interference, you call it monitoring thresholds. The language was clean, clinical, detached, but the outcome was always the same. Pressure without fingerprints, influence without evidence, control without command. The war was never about territory, it was about access. Access to thought patterns, access to emotional rhythms, access to moments when the mind loosens its guard. Fatigue, grief, celebration, prayer. Especially prayer. Because prayer opens something, it creates alignment, and alignment, when unguarded, can be redirected. That is the part I can no longer keep to myself. I saw how confession was manipulated, how guilt was redirected, until people blamed themselves for interference they did not initiate. I saw revelations delayed, distorted, softened, all while the subject believed the silence was their own failure to listen. And when someone finally sensed something was wrong, the system was already in place to discredit them. Stress, imagination, fear, overthinking. The oldest methods still work when wrapped in modern certainty. This is warfare without uniforms. This is testimony without witnesses. This is confession spoken after the damage has already passed through generations of doubt. I am telling you because awareness disrupts access. Once you know that observation can wear a harmless face, you stop offering everything freely. Once you understand that pressure can be applied without force, you learn to recognize resistance without panic. Once revelation arrives, it cannot be undone. It settles. It changes posture. It sharpens attention. I was trained to stay quiet. Silence was part of the assignment. But silence is also how it continues. So consider this your warning and your shield. Pay attention to what lingers too long, to what watches without purpose, to what drains without confrontation. This is not fear speaking. This is recognition. And recognition is where the war begins to shift. This is not superstition. This is not paranoia. And this is not folklore. I didn't learn this in church. I learned this inside witchcraft. Let that land before you reject it. Because what I'm about to confess did not come from sermons or stories passed down to scare children. It came from instruction, from training, from rooms where belief was treated as a system that could be studied, adjusted, exploited. I was taught rules before I was taught consequences. That alone should tell you how serious this was. There's a rule, they obey. Everything does, and until you understand that rule, none of this will make sense. The rule is permission. Nothing crosses without it. Nothing stays without it. Nothing watches without access being granted somewhere, somehow. That access is rarely dramatic. It is given through neglect, through exhaustion, through curiosity masked as innocence, through moments when people stop guarding what they assume no one wants. Animals are used because they are trusted by default. No one questions a cat lingering too long. No one challenges a bird returning to the same place every morning. No one suspects a dog staring past its owner, fixed on something that never speaks. Trust lowers resistance. Resistance is the only thing that disrupts the signal. This was explained to me plainly. No mysticism, no poetry, just function. I was shown how intention anchors, how attention feeds, how repetition builds a pathway strong enough to carry influence without being felt. The warfare was quiet because loud methods invite defense. Quiet methods invite consent. Here is the part I avoided admitting to myself. I participated. Not with clause or chance, but with compliance. With silence. With the lie that observation without interference was harmless. But observation changes outcomes. Being seen alters behavior. Being watched reshapes thought. And when the watcher is hidden, the subject assumes the pressure is internal. That is how testimonies were broken before they were ever spoken. I heard confessions that never reached relief because they were intercepted by doubt. I watched people second-guess revelations until the moment passed and the window closed. I saw truth delayed long enough to lose its urgency. That was the strategy. Delay is more effective than denial. You think warfare looks like attack. It rarely does. It looks like distraction at the exact moment clarity tries to surface. It looks like fatigue when resolve is required. It looks like noise when stillness would expose everything. The confession I am making now carries risk, not because of retaliation, but because exposure collapses structure. Once the mechanism is named, it loses elegance. Once you recognize the pattern, it cannot work the same way again. This is the revelation. The battle has never been about power. It has always been about agreement. Break agreement, and access closes. Withdraw attention, and influence weakens. Stand alert, and observation loses its grip. I was trained to exploit openness. I am now telling you how to protect it. Watch what feels familiar but drains you. Question what lingers without reason. Guard moments of prayer, of rest, of clarity. These are not neutral spaces. They are contested. This testimony is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to restore agency. Because once you understand the rule they obey, you are no longer an easy participant in a war you never agreed to fight. After years inside structured systems of influence, and now years outside of them, I understand both sides of this reality. That is all the authority I need to claim. I was never the one in front. I was never meant to be known. The work required anonymity, obedience, and distance from consequence. You learn quickly how power prefers shadows, how it rewards those who don't ask what the outcome looks like for the person on the other end. And then something changed. It wasn't sudden. There was no dramatic break, no public collapse. Transformation rarely announces itself. It begins as discomfort, a hesitation before action, a question that refuses to stay quiet. I noticed that the systems demanded my silence more than my loyalty. That was the first confession I made to myself. I had seen too much to pretend neutrality. Outside those structures, clarity arrived slowly, but it arrived whole. I recognized the patterns I once enforced. The same pressure, the same fatigue, the same quiet discouragement wrapped in logic and timing. Only now I could see the source instead of rationalizing the effect. This exposure is not motivated by recognition. I gain nothing from speaking except resistance. I am not here to impress, persuade, or entertain. I am here because warning is the final responsibility of anyone who once helped aim the weapon. Here is the revelation that matters most. Warfare is sustained by consent more than force. As long as a person believes their struggle is internal, the system remains untouched. As long as they confess the wrong guilt, the pressure continues uninterrupted. As long as they assume silence means peace, the influence holds. I participated in that illusion. That is my testimony. Confession does not end with regret. It ends with exposure. And exposure changes the rules of engagement. Once truth is named, it no longer requires belief to operate. It simply exists, demanding response. You were never weak. You were managed. This is not an accusation. It is a correction. And now that you can see the structure instead of blaming the symptoms, the war no longer happens only to you. It happens with you aware. And that awareness is exactly what those systems were designed to prevent. The first time I saw it, I thought it was coincidence. A report crossed my desk that didn't belong to any normal category. No threat level, no breach, no visible action. Just a note in the margin, written by someone who understood how to warn without alerting anyone else. Subject reports persistent observation during moments of prayer. That alone meant nothing. People report many things when belief is involved. The system is designed to filter those out. The second time, the pattern became clear. Different location. Different person. Same language, same timing. The observation always appeared when alignment was strongest: fasting, confession, private devotion, moments of surrender, and always followed by the same aftermath: confusion, exhaustion, an unexplainable sense of resistance where there had been clarity before. That is when the word coincidence quietly exited the room. The third time, someone got spiritually attacked. Not violently, that's important to understand. No screams, no collapse, no outward spectacle, just a sudden rupture. A person who had been steady for years broke down within days. Their confidence turned inward, their certainty fractured into self-accusation. They believed the interference was punishment. They confessed to things they did not do, searching for a cause that wasn't theirs. That is when I realized this was warfare disguised as psychology. Here's the part most people never hear. Not every animal is used. Some are ignored entirely, too visible, too symbolic, too obvious. Others are dismissed because they draw attention, invite questions, provoke superstition. Those are inefficient, but certain ones are preferred, ones that belong in the background, ones humans have trained themselves to overlook, ones associated with harmlessness, routine, or nature. When something feels ordinary, the guard lowers. That is the rule, everything else follows, and one is almost always a warning sign. Not because of what it is, but because of when it appears. Timing is the signature. When observation aligns perfectly with vulnerability, when presence coincides with opening, when distraction follows devotion, you are no longer dealing with chance. This is where my confession becomes unavoidable. I was taught how to recognize thresholds. Moments when a person becomes reachable without consent. Grief, gratitude, repentance, hope. The system does not force entry. It waits for invitation, often unintentional. And once access is granted, influence is subtle enough that the subject believes every thought is their own. That belief is the strongest lock there is. I participated by remaining silent. That is my failure. I reviewed reports, signed off on dismissals, allowed patterns to be buried under language like stress response and projection. I told myself neutrality was safety. I told myself observation was harmless. But observation changes behavior, and behavior shapes destiny. The revelation came when I recognized the same markers in myself: interrupted focus, resistance during moments that once felt effortless, a heaviness I couldn't explain, paired with an urge to blame my own discipline. That is when the truth stopped being academic. Confession is not dramatic, it is precise. This warfare feeds on ignorance, but it survives on self-blame. As long as people believe resistance is proof of personal failure, they will keep offering access, again and again, trying harder, confessing deeper, opening wider. That is why awareness is dangerous to the system. Once you understand that not every struggle originates within you, discernment replaces accusation. Once discernment arrives, access narrows. Once access narrows, influence weakens. I am revealing this because testimony breaks patterns that silence protects. Pay attention to repetition, to timing, to what appears consistently when you are most aligned, then vanishes when you are distracted. That is where the truth leaves fingerprints without touching anything. If you're following closely, you already feel the shift. Comment, "I'm aware," if you understand that recognition is the first countermeasure. Because once you see the pattern, it no longer owns you. I need to be precise now, because this part was never meant to be spoken out loud. Animals were chosen for reasons most people would never question. They belong everywhere. No one challenges their presence. No one interrogates a bird on a wire, a cat at a doorway, a dog that stops and stares too long. Their silence is trusted. Their innocence is assumed. And that assumption is the opening. In the field, they were never called animals. They were referred to as carriers, anchors, passive observers. Language again doing its work, stripping meaning down until conscience stayed quiet. Here's what they were used for. They monitored states that machines could never read correctly. Emotional pressure, internal conflict, fear that hasn't reached the face yet, faith that wavers before the words do. They were positioned where people were most exposed: grief, isolation, exhaustion, prayer. Especially prayer that came from desperation rather than discipline. I saw the reports. I helped write some of them. An animal lingering too long outside a home where loss had just occurred, reappearing during moments of breakdown, showing up again when the subject tried to regain focus. These weren't random sightings logged for curiosity. They were confirmations, signals that something inside had opened. When fear rises, something loosens. When exhaustion settles in, defenses thin. When prayer weakens into pleading, access widens. That is what they watched for. People always ask why the sightings repeat. Why it's the same animal. Why it appears at moments that feel personal. That repetition is not accidental. It establishes familiarity. Familiarity lowers resistance, and lowered resistance allows observation to move closer without alarm. I remember the first time I understood what I was participating in. A subject had been holding steady for months, discipline intact, no visible fracture. Then a single event, a quiet loss, one no one else noticed. Within days, reports changed. The observer stayed longer, returned more often. The language shifted from monitoring to confirmed. That word meant vulnerability had been identified. I should have walked away then. I didn't. Because here is the part that turns testimony into confession. They were never meant to intervene directly. That was the rule. Observation only. But observation alone changes behavior. Being watched alters posture, thought, rhythm, even if the subject never consciously knows why they feel unsettled. And after enough confirmation, after enough quiet reports, something else was activated. Not force, not possession. Influence. Subtle pressure placed where resistance was already tired. Doubt encouraged where certainty had thinned. Delay introduced where clarity once moved freely. People didn't lose faith overnight. They misplaced it, misjudged themselves, wondered why prayer felt heavy, why focus slipped, why peace took longer to return. The most disturbing part isn't why they're used, it's what happens after they report back. Once vulnerability is confirmed, the subject is mapped, patterns logged, timing learned, weak moments anticipated. From there, pressure no longer needs constant observation. It's applied strategically, invisibly, spaced just enough to feel internal. I am revealing this because I watched it happen too many times to too many people who blamed themselves for something they didn't initiate. This is warfare that leaves no bruises. Testimony without courtrooms, confession spoken years too late. And if you've ever felt watched without knowing why, if you've noticed patterns you couldn't explain, if prayer felt interrupted rather than unanswered, understand this. Awareness changes the equation. Because once you recognize the method, it loses its advantage. And once confession becomes revelation, silence is no longer available to them. Let me tell you about her. I won't use her name because this testimony was never meant for recognition. It was meant for release. She came to me exhausted in a way sleep could not touch. Not tired from work, not drained from stress anyone could point to. This was deeper. Her energy felt thinned out, like something had been taking small portions for a long time without ever being noticed. She said it felt as if rest no longer restored her, as if waking up was just another form of effort. The problem appeared ordinary at first. Animals. Always animals. A cat that didn't belong to anyone sitting outside her window at the same hour every night. Birds lining the fence behind her home, unmoving, watching longer than felt natural. A dog that followed her for 3 blocks and stopped only when she entered her building, never barking, never approaching, just standing there until she disappeared from sight. She tried to rationalize it. People always do. She told herself she was noticing things more because she was already tired. That fear sharpens attention, that patterns are easy to invent when the mind is stretched thin. But the fear didn't arrive loudly, it arrived as unease. A sense of being observed without threat, and that, strangely, was worse. At night, her sleep fractured. She didn't have nightmares. That was the confusing part. Instead, she woke up suddenly, heart steady, room quiet, mind alert, as if called awake by something that had already stepped back. She described it as interruption rather than terror. Like someone entering a room, standing still and leaving before being seen. Her prayers began to feel tangled. She would start speaking with confidence, then lose her words halfway through. Scripture she had known for years slipped away mid-sentence. Focus dissolved. Doubt crept in quietly, not accusing, just suggesting delay. Pray later. Finish tomorrow. Rest first. She blamed herself. That was the design. The turning point did not come through fear. It came through frustration. One night, after waking again, she sat upright and said something different. She didn't beg, She didn't ask questions. She didn't search for the right words. She spoke with authority she didn't know she had. She addressed what she could not see as if it could hear, because somewhere deep inside she knew it could. She declared boundaries. She named her space. She rejected access. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. And for the first time in weeks, her thoughts did not scatter while she prayed. They aligned. That was the revelation. Clarity is not loud. It is steady. The next morning, the animals were gone. Not gradually. Completely. No cat at the window, no birds on the fence, no dog on the corner. Days passed, then weeks. The pattern never returned. But something else changed too. Her energy came back in layers. First emotional stability, then rest that actually rested her. Then prayer that flowed without resistance. She told me it felt like standing upright after walking bent for years. Peace replaced confusion, not because answers arrived, but because interference left. This is what people misunderstand about warfare. Victory does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like quiet returning to a room that had been crowded without your permission. I am confessing this because her story is not rare. If this feels familiar, if parts of this testimony echo something you have not had language for, then you already understand more than you think. Type "I receive clarity" if this story feels familiar, and stay with me, because this was only the first confession. Most people miss this part, and that omission is not accidental. The war does not advance through dramatic moments. It advances through neglect, through the quiet decision to ignore sensitivity because it feels inconvenient, through laughter used as armor, through conversations shared with people who were never meant to hold that information. This is where my warning begins. Sensitivity is not weakness. It is an early signal. When something shifts in your awareness, when you feel watched without paranoia, interrupted without cause, drained without explanation, that is not imagination misfiring. That is perception doing its job before language catches up. I was taught to exploit the moment people laughed it off. Laughter creates dismissal. Dismissal creates exposure. Once someone mocks their own perception, they abandon authority over it. That was always the opening. You convince yourself it's silly, and suddenly you are open without defense. You explain it away before understanding it. You hand over ground without realizing you were standing on it. Then comes the second mistake. Talking to the wrong people. There are listeners who do not listen to help. They listen to map you. When you speak too freely, when you confess confusion without discernment, you give shape to something that was still incomplete. Some people do not need permission, they need confirmation. And careless words provide it. I learned how information travels, how testimony, when spoken prematurely, becomes evidence against the one who carries it. How revelation shared without wisdom gets diluted, redirected, or used as leverage. The war rewards impatience. But the greatest access point has always been fear. Fear is not harmless, it's information. Fear tells them where you feel exposed. Fear reveals what you think you lack. Fear broadcasts uncertainty louder than any spoken word. When fear enters the body, authority leaves the room. And authority, once absent, is easy to replace. I saw it happen repeatedly. People sensed intrusion and reacted with panic. They watched too closely. They tried to confront without grounding. They fixated instead of standing firm. And fixation feeds the very system they were trying to escape. This is the confession part. We counted on fear. We studied it. We anticipated it. Because fear collapses boundaries faster than ignorance ever could. The goal was never possession. It was permission through reaction. Here is the revelation most never receive. Attention without authority is an invitation. You were never meant to respond in terror. You were meant to respond in position. Calm does not mean passive. Stillness does not mean surrender. Authority does not announce itself loudly, it settles, it anchors, it decides. When someone understands who they are, observation loses leverage. And now the truth that completes this warning. There is one reaction which is hope you'll have, and it gives them access. They hope you'll fear what you don't understand instead of recognizing what you carry. Because fear bends inward. Authority stands upright. This is why discernment matters more than exposure. This is why silence at the right moment is stronger than confrontation. This is why prayer feels blocked only when posture shifts from confidence to panic. The war does not end when you notice it. It shifts when you stop reacting the way they expect. Have faith, and it gives them access. That was the phrase used. Access, not possession, not dominance. Access is quieter. Access is permission without awareness, and once granted, it does not rush. It studies. This is where the second testimony begins. I was brought in after the pattern had already formed. A family, disciplined, prayerful, orderly. No history of superstition, no hunger for spectacle. They didn't come asking for answers, they came asking for relief. That distinction matters. They noticed the animals first, always during prayer times, never random, never chaotic, always the same kind, same positioning, same stillness. One by the window, one near the entrance, occasionally more, but never all at once, watching without agitation, present without threat, easy to dismiss if you wanted to. They tried to ignore it. That was mistake number one. Sleep was next, fragmented, not nightmares, interruptions. Waking at the same hour, every night, as if something expected them to be conscious. Children waking without fear but unable to return to rest. Adults exhausted without having done anything strenuous. Doctors called it stress. Schedules were adjusted, nothing changed. Then came the heaviness, not sadness, not despair. Weight. A resistance that pressed down during moments that once felt light. Prayer became difficult to start and harder to finish. Words felt delayed, focus slipped. Fasting felt ineffective, as if effort no longer produced clarity. That is when they knew something had crossed a line. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I had heard this cadence before. This is the part of my confession. I knew exactly what stage they were in. The strategy relies on endurance. It waits until people assume the problem is themselves, until self-correction replaces discernment, until spiritual effort turns inward instead of upward. That's when authority is quietly surrendered. But something changed. During a fast that was never meant to be dramatic, no announcement, no social declaration, the atmosphere shifted. The family didn't feel stronger immediately. They felt exposed, alert, as if the room itself had lost its cover, and the animals stopped appearing. That was not coincidence. The sleep disruptions ended within 3 nights, not gradually, completely. The heaviness lifted without ceremony. Prayer returned without resistance. Focus sharpened, not louder, clearer. That clarity is what confirmed it. Before, they questioned everything. After, they recognized patterns. Before, they reacted. After, they responded. Before, fear whispered explanations. After, authority spoke instructions. I watched this happen, and it forced another confession from me. One I had avoided longer than the first. The system depends on ignorance more than power. Once discernment enters a space, access collapses. Observation loses leverage. Influence retreats without confrontation because it cannot operate when named. That is why testimony matters. That is why revelation is always followed by resistance. That is why silence is encouraged and confusion is rewarded. This is warfare fought without sound. This is confession offered after survival. This is revelation meant to restore posture. If you are seeing repetition where there should be randomness, if your sleep fractures only when alignment strengthens, if heaviness arrives without cause and leaves without explanation, pay attention. And share this with someone who keeps seeing the same animal repeatedly. I didn't walk away all at once. That would make this story cleaner than it was. The truth came in fragments, through exposure, repetition, and finally consequence. In warfare like this, revelation is never delivered dramatically. It arrives as clarity you can no longer unsee. There was a moment when the chain of command asked for a report on resistance. Not rebellion. Resistance. People who were no longer responding the way projections said they should. Their fatigue lifted too quickly. Their focus returned without explanation. Their prayers began to land. That's when I understood what had been underestimated. You cannot pressure someone who has closed the right doors. So listen carefully now, because what follows is not theory. It is the method I watched dismantle operations quietly, without confrontation, without spectacle. First, do not panic. Panic is cooperation. Panic fractures attention and hands over control voluntarily. Everything we relied on required emotional excess, fear, urgency, obsession. Calm disrupts the signal. When you feel watched, pressured, unsettled, your first act of defense is steadiness. Breathe. Stay present. Nothing advances when you refuse to scatter. Second, close emotional doors. Not every thought deserves a response. Not every feeling deserves hospitality. Emotional doors are opened through unresolved anger, lingering shame, nostalgia that weakens discernment, and constant self-accusation. You close them by naming what does not belong to you and refusing to rehearse it. Silence is powerful when it is chosen. Third, pray with authority, not fear. Authority does not shout. It does not beg. It does not explain itself. The most effective prayers I witnessed were simple, deliberate, and steady. They did not focus on what was wrong. They stated what was true. Fear-based prayer leaks power. Authority-based prayer establishes boundaries. You are not trying to be heard. You are declaring alignment. Fourth, remove verbal agreements. This part matters more than people realize. Words spoken repeatedly become permissions. I'm always tired. This runs in my family. I can't break this. Even jokes can function as contracts when repeated. Speak out loud if you need to. I withdraw agreement with anything that weakens my clarity, my peace, or my purpose. We tracked language patterns for a reason. Words shape access. Fifth, stay consistent. Consistency dismantles pressure systems faster than confrontation ever could. One calm day does not change much. 10 steady days do. The goal was always to exhaust people into giving up. When you remain steady without obsession, without chasing signs, without overcorrecting, the interference loses leverage. This is the part that rarely gets said. Nothing dramatic happens when this works. No rush, no spectacle, just space, clarity, rest, returning to places that felt locked for years. That's how I knew the war was real, and that it could be resisted. This is my confession and my testimony. I participated. I observed. And now I reveal what breaks the pattern. Quiet strength, clear boundaries, chosen authority. If you're still here, if this resonates without alarming you, that's your confirmation. Comment, I stand firm, if you're still with me. There are moments when monitoring increases. You don't notice at first because everything seems normal. A quiet day, a simple routine, a prayer that feels ordinary. But the pattern shifts. A pause in conversation, a glance that lingers too long, the subtle adjustment of schedules. These are not coincidences. They are the preparation for a strike, not on your body, but on your mind, your focus, your alignment. I call them emotional vulnerability windows. Times when fatigue has thinned your patience, when grief has opened the cracks, when hope begins to swell because something feels within reach. These are moments they watch most carefully, because this is when defenses are weakest and influence is most effective. And make no mistake, they don't attack with force. They infiltrate with subtlety, masking interference as accident, distraction as care, doubt as guidance. Then come the isolation periods. You think it is by choice. You think it is for reflection, for focus, for growth. But isolation is a weapon. Alone, your energy can be measured, your intentions mapped, your responses predicted. Every pause, every moment of quiet becomes a ledger in their files. And when they have counted enough, they know how to act or how to wait. Waiting is the cruelest part, because the longer it lasts, the more it feels like your own failing, your own hesitation. And yet, in these same intervals, spiritual breakthroughs are most likely to happen. Moments when the mind opens, when understanding deepens, when clarity arrives. The irony is brutal. The exact conditions that make you most powerful are the conditions that make you most visible. It is a paradox that I learned too late. Your rise is when you are most vulnerable. I know this because I've watched it unfold too many times. I've witnessed people on the verge of revelation, poised to step into a new level of purpose. And just as their clarity peaks, subtle interventions ripple through their space. Distracting thoughts, misplaced trust, moments of hesitation that slow, bend, or even redirect the course of their breakthrough. The most dangerous moment isn't when you're weak. It's when you're about to rise. When alignment builds in your mind, your heart, your spirit. That's the instant the stakes are highest. That's when they apply their quietest, most precise pressure. Not to destroy you, but to recalibrate the trajectory of your ascent. And here's the confession I can no longer hide. I was once part of that process. I observed those precise moments. I documented the rises, the breakthroughs, the impending clarity. I cataloged the pauses, the cracks, the moments where intervention could shift everything. And every time, I carried the burden of knowing that what looked like random struggle or delay was anything but random. But awareness changes everything. Once you see it, you recognize the signs before the interception. Once you know the patterns, you can guard the moments that matter most. Once the revelation is yours, it cannot be stolen. This is the core of the warfare I lived through. Not battles of fire or steel, but battles of timing, of attention, of influence over what is most sacred, focus, purpose, and the moments when destiny brushes against the soul. The countdown is always happening. Every rise has a shadow of observation. Every breakthrough carries a mark of danger. And every soul approaching clarity is walking through the eye of a storm they cannot yet name. Would you like me to continue the sequence into 35 to 40, where the testimony moves into the confessions that reveal how to survive these attacks? I didn't understand the timing at first. That was the detail that haunted me the longest. The monitoring never intensified when people were failing. It never escalated during collapse, addiction, apathy, or despair. Those states required no attention. There was nothing to interrupt, nothing to slow down, nothing to reroute. The attention came after progress, after the first breakthrough, after clarity, after discipline returned, after prayer stopped sounding desperate and started sounding steady. That was the pattern we were trained to recognize. This is the part of the testimony most people never hear. Warfare reacts to movement, not stagnation. The system does not waste resources on those already fragmented. It watches the ones aligning, the ones becoming consistent, the ones whose inner world is beginning to stabilize. That is why breakthroughs trigger monitoring. A breakthrough is not loud on the outside, but it is disruptive underneath. It restructures habits. It sharpens focus. It closes access points that were once wide open. And when access begins to narrow, pressure increases. Not to destroy, but to distract, delay, and exhaust. I saw it documented, I participated in it, and I am confessing that now without disguise. Consistency was always the threat. One moment of insight could be dismissed, one emotional surge could be redirected. But consistency, quiet, repeated alignment, created interference we could not override easily. It collapsed surveillance structures because consistency removes volatility. And volatility is what allows influence. When a person becomes steady, predictable in discipline, anchored in purpose, observation loses leverage. There are fewer openings, fewer reactions, fewer impulses to exploit. The system depended on emotional spikes, internal arguments, self-doubt loops. Consistency starved it. That is why disruption often comes disguised as urgency when you finally settle. Sudden distractions, old thoughts resurfacing without invitation, unexplainable resistance to what once felt natural. None of it random, all of it reactive. I know because I helped design the response. But here is the revelation that ended my participation. Awareness changes the terrain entirely. Fear thrives on confusion. Confusion thrives on invisibility. The moment you understand that pressure increases because you are advancing, fear loses its authority. It no longer feels like a warning. It reveals itself as confirmation. Awareness dismantles fear because it reframes the experience. What once felt like threat becomes evidence of momentum. What once caused retreat becomes a signal to remain still and continue. That is the confession I avoided for years. The fear was never proof of danger. It was proof of growth. And here is the line I was trained never to say out loud, but it is the truth that governs everything. Darkness doesn't monitor the defeated. It monitors the rising. Once you understand that, the entire war shifts. You stop panicking at resistance. You stop internalizing interference. You stop questioning your direction every time pressure appears. You remain consistent. And consistency breaks surveillance. I didn't step away cleanly. There is no clean exit from a war that never officially existed. When I stopped sending them, the silence didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no relief at first, only exposure. That's the part no one prepares you for. Once you withdraw cooperation, you become visible in a different way. You feel the pressure shift. You notice how often distraction used to arrive right on time, how resistance used to feel like your own weakness instead of outside influence. This is the confession part. They never teach you how to deliver. I signed off on things I didn't fully question because they were framed as protection, observation for balance, intervention for order. But balance, when enforced without consent, becomes domination. And order, when imposed on belief, becomes captivity. The revelation came during a debrief that was supposed to be routine. A case file. A subject flagged for spiritual interference anomalies. That was the phrase. The anomaly wasn't rebellion. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The subject had started recognizing patterns. They had stopped reacting on cue. Their prayers had shifted tone, shorter, grounded, unavailable to manipulation. That's when I understood the real objective. The war wasn't against people, it was against alignment. Aligned people are harder to fracture, harder to exhaust, harder to redirect. You can't flood them with confusion if they've learned stillness. You can't starve them of peace if they've stopped outsourcing authority over their inner world. That was the moment I crossed the line internally, even if no one else saw it. I began reviewing older testimonies, confessions buried under classifications, revelations written off as breakdowns. Every one of them followed the same arc: awareness, resistance, isolation, dismissal. The system didn't destroy them. It waited for the world to do it instead. So I'm saying this plainly now. If you felt watched without threat, if pressure shows up without confrontation, if clarity arrives and something immediately tries to scatter it, you are not imagining it, and you are not alone. This warfare depends on secrecy and self-blame. It collapses when named. It weakens when exposed. It loses access when you stop narrating your life through guilt and fear. That is the truth I was never supposed to say out loud. And now, before this ends, I'm going to do the one thing that was always discouraged, because it works. Take a breath. This is not a performance. This is coverage. I speak peace over the mind listening right now. I ask for every open door that was never meant to be opened to be closed. I ask for interference to lose permission and confusion to lose ground. Let clarity return without force. Let rest come without explanation. Let protection settle quietly and completely. Nothing follows you from here. You are covered. Subscribe for truth they don't want exposed. Comment covered if you stayed to the end.